Now, Madam Speaker, before us today is a question of privilege. Now, questions of privileges are often like solar eclipses. They don't happen very often, but here we find ourselves today debating one on the same day. I want to begin by thanking the honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes for bringing forward this important question and stating that I will be voting in favour of this motion, but not in favour of the amendment moved by the Liberal government. For more than a year and a half, this House and multiple parliamentary committees have been seized with the ArriveCAN scandal, or as it has come to be known, ArriveScam. From the first indications of concern in 2022 to the damning Auditor General's report in February of 2024, week after week, meeting after meeting, new evidence has been slowly unveiled that shows a pattern of deceit, cover-up, and potential corruption. We know that through an opaque network of contractors and subcontractors, the costs of ArriveCAN were slowly driven up, and that a small group of select people enriched themselves while performing little to no work. We don't know yet exactly how they achieved this or who within government assisted them. One of the reasons we do not know all the details is because there was such an apparent lack of documentation and accountability. So few records were found by the Auditor General that they were unable to determine the exact cost of the app. Indeed, the $60 million figure we've been citing could even be too low. We just don't know because, as the Auditor General herself said, what was most surprising about her audit was what they didn't find. They didn't find the documentation to confirm the work that was completed. And we know who benefited, Madam Speaker. A company of two people operating out of a basement, GC Strategies. And Madam Speaker, just this past week, last Thursday, April 4th, at the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, we were told by the multi-billion-dollar multinational firm KPMG, who I might add have 10,000 employees. They were told by a senior government official, not to contract directly with the government, this multi-billion-dollar firm, 10,000 employees. They were instead told that they must work through a two-person company that has no IT experience. We learned, Madam Speaker, that KPMG was paid $400,000 for the work they performed through GC Strategies, and that GC Strategies themselves took $90,000 on top of that.
What a gig.
A $90,000 bill that went to GC Strategies for no IT work performed. Yet we know that these two people, operating out of effectively a shell of a company, have done all they can to avoid the accountability for their actions and to deliberately mislead Parliament, committees, and all Canadians on this issue. That is why the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, more commonly known as the mighty OGO, reported to this House that, quote, the committee was unable to ascertain certain facts about Mr. Firth, who repeatedly refused to answer questions. The OGO report goes on to state, quote, additionally, some of the witness testimony provided by Mr. Firth was called into question as being misleading or false. As the member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes rightly pointed out, Mr. Firth has on several occasions refused to answer direct questions when he was asked, and refused to answer and has been caught providing misinformation to Canadians. One specific issue is that he has refused to disclose whose testimonials are on his website. The website quotes senior government officials giving glowing reviews of GC Strategies, but yet Mr. Firth has as of yet refused to indicate who those senior government officials are. Madam Speaker, this House cannot and must not tolerate the disrespect and the degrading of the authority of Parliament and its committees. Witnesses who are summoned to testify must answer questions truthfully and not withhold information that is duly requested. Madam Speaker, as the member for Thousand Islands, Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes thoroughly explained on March 20th. There is a long and vital history, both within Canada and in its Westminster counterparts, showing that a refusal to answer questions before a committee is indeed a contempt of this House. And as much as I enjoy referencing and quoting from previous speakers' rulings, from Boskin-Gagnon, from Beauchene's 6th edition, from the powers of Parliamentary House to send for persons, papers and records, and indeed from Erskine May, I will indeed spare the House from once again hearing me repeat some of the passages that have already been quoted by other members. But spoiler alert, Madam Speaker, I will in a bit quote from Sir John Bourino, one of the older authorities in this House dating back to the early part of the last century. I will, however, point out that in the 8.5 years that I have had the privilege and honour of serving as a Member of Parliament, I have found that on far too many occasions this House has had to deal with breaches of parliamentary privilege, including the rights of the House collectively or the rights and immunities of individual members. Far too often we have seen those rights and privileges violated. And the slow erosions of the rights and privileges of Parliament is not a small matter. It is indeed an absolute threat to our democracy. I would recall, Madam Speaker, that on June 17th, 2021, in what turned out to be one of the final days of the previous Parliament, members of all three opposition parties made the wise and appropriate decision to pass a motion on a question of privilege. With the passage of that motion, we called the President of the Public Health Agency of Canada to attend the bar of the House for the purposes of receiving, on behalf of the agency, an admonishment delivered by the Speaker and delivering up documents ordered by this House. That motion was an important step in pushing back against the loss and disuse of the powers and privileges of the House of Commons. It is unfortunate that 147 Liberal members of Parliament voted against that motion. Moreover, I would also point out, Madam Speaker, that when the federal agency at the centre of that scandal, the Winnipeg lab scandals, is also at the centre of this scandal today, the Public Health Agency of Canada. There is clearly a problem with the governance and accountability of both the Public Health Agency of Canada and the Canada Border Services Agency. Everyone responsible, including cabinet ministers, public servants, and outside contractors, must answer for their actions or inaction related to these scandals. Madam Speaker, I would recall for this House some of the testimony that we heard from senior government officials at the Public Accounts Committee, including the President of the CBSA. The President of the CBSA stated that they just didn't know who approved the ArriveCAN application. They just didn't know. It reminds me of an old Saturday Night Live sketch in which O.J. Simpson was going around the golf course trying to figure out who was the real killer. Madam Speaker, the President of the Canada Border Services Agency just couldn't tell the committee who approved the ArriveCAN app, despite being the President of the agency and having full, unfettered access to all documents and people within the agency. It is simply mind-boggling that that was the testimony we heard. We also heard from the President of the CBSA that she couldn't find any evidence of the company Deloitte being in, quote, that penalty box. Well, Madam Speaker, once again, it is not shocking that she may not have been able to find the written evidence, but there's no question she could have talked to the public servants within that agency to find out the reasons why Deloitte was in the, quote, penalty box. Now, perhaps, Madam Speaker, some of the emails may no longer have existed because we know now that one of the key central players in this scandal had deleted permanently all of their emails. And we learned last week that to delete emails is, quote, surprisingly easy. Another dark mark against this institution. And then as well, last week we heard from the CFO, the Vice President and CFO of the Canada Border Services Agency, who indicated that there was as many as 6 or 7 outside contractors who were also employed by the Government of Canada. But then when pressed for further information, he waffled, and he actually gave 4 separate answers to this very simple question. I think he thought that the British sitcom Yes Minister was an instructional video rather than the comedic genius that it actually was. But 4 different answers to one simple question, and never once did we actually get the truth to the question of double dipping within the Canada Border Services Agency. Now, Madam Speaker, there is before this House an amendment that I frankly believe would lessen the importance of this motion. Nearly 3 years ago, we heard from the Winnipeg Labs document, and that motion was passed. Now, it is clear that the amendment as proposed by the Liberal member for Kingston and the Islands, who serves as the Deputy House Leader of the Liberal government, that this amendment must be disregarded. Indeed, when this were this amendment to be passed, it would not only belittle, but would also lessen the seriousness of this situation and ignores the importance of the rights and privileges of parliamentary committees. And, Madam Speaker, it would significantly delay meaningful accountability on this matter until May at the very earliest. I believe strongly that the supremacy of this House of Parliament must be preserved. And by sending this off to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs for as long as 2 weeks, we will once again delay accountability. We must uncover the truth, the whole truth, and as they say, nothing but the truth. And that is what the original motion intends to do, and is why we must pull back from the amendment. Now, Madam Speaker, I recognize that the act of calling a person to the bar to be admonished by the Speaker and to be compelled to answer questions that a person may previously have been unwilling to answer is a very rarely used power for Parliament. But I strongly disagree with the member's argument that this is a reason not to use these powers. To the contrary, the rarity of this motion shows just how unacceptable the actions of Mr. Firth and GC Strategies are. Now, Madam Speaker, just because an action has not been used recently, there is no question that it is nonetheless appropriate in this House. As promised earlier, I will now cite from Sir John Bourrineau's Parliamentary Procedure and Practice in the Dominion of Canada, 4th edition, 1916. And for those following along around at home, it is pages 70 to 74. And Bourrineau writes, and I quote, "A witness who neglects or refuses to obey the order of the House will be sent for in custody of the Sergeant at Arms. Any person refusing to obey this or any other order, or aiding any witness to keep out of the way, may be declared guilty of a contempt of the House and brought before it in custody, that he may be dealt with according to its will and pleasure. Witnesses who refuse to answer proper questions will be admonished and ordered to answer them. If they refuse, they may be committed until they express their willingness to answer." And again, that is from Sir John Bourrineau. But that is not the only authority, Madam Speaker. I would also draw your attention to Beauchesne's Parliamentary Rules and Forms, 4th edition, 1958, at citations 329 and 330. Beauchesne's 2nd edition, at citation 701. And of course, Erskine May 18th edition, 1971, at page 672. I won't read those in the record, but I know honourable members will go seek out those citations later today. But, Madam Speaker, it brings us back to the fact that while we may not have used these powers in the past or in recent times, they are nonetheless important to the matter at hand. The fact that these extreme powers are used only in extraordinary circumstances should serve to express and underline the seriousness of the situation we find ourselves in. Indeed, Madam Speaker, I remind the House that the report from the OGO Committee was a unanimous report of all members of this House, and it was concurred in by this House unanimously. What is also often referred to as the grand inquest of the nation will only be effective if we can receive the answers that are needed. To choose not to pass this motion is to choose to not exercise our powers in this case. It would be choosing to willingly weaken this House as a democratic institution. I do not accept that option. Madam Speaker, based on the evidence collected thus far from committees in Parliament and by those outside of Parliament, including journalists and other accountability mechanisms, it has been clear that GC Strategies has used individuals within the federal public service to wrongfully win government contracts and to enrich themselves while performing little and, in fact, no IT work for the Canadian people. The system of bidding and contracting between these groups and organizations and the federal government has become so corrupted that this two-person firm was able to decide on the contract conditions for a contract that, surprise, surprise, they ended up winning. This organization even uses the name GC Strategies to stand for Government of Canada strategies and to grant themselves a fake sense of authority and legitimacy. As committee meetings have proceeded, these two individuals, Mr. Firth and Mr. Anthony, have been uncooperative, evasive, and in fact, dishonest. On multiple occasions, they refused committee summonses and invitations, and only appeared most recently before the OGO committee on the threat of arrest by the Sergeant at Arms. Only when the Sergeant at Arms was ready to place these individuals under the arrest by the authority of Parliament did they finally appear before the House. And when he did eventually appear, Mr. Anthony was at worst evasive and at best completely oblivious to the business of his own firm, despite having the titles of partner and chief security officer. He let on that he knew very little about this company of which he was a partner. And when Mr. Firth eventually appeared, he was again uncooperative and frankly dishonest. Mr. Firth refused to answer basic questions, including whether he had lied to a parliamentary committee before, whether he had lied about meeting government officials outside of government offices, and he refused to tell members of Parliament the names of the public office holders with whom he had met outside of government offices. He refused to tell members the names of the government officials he worked with to get over 100 contracts. He refused to tell members which senior government officials gave endorsements on his company website. And he lied about providing hospitality to government officials. Here we are, Madam Speaker, with key facts still being hidden. The people's representatives in this place must be able to hold this government and its contractors to account on this web of deception and fraud. We need to know who else benefited from this scandal, how it was allowed to carry out for so long. Madam Speaker, Canada is a parliamentary democracy. The powers invested in this House derive from the Constitution Act 1867, and the duly elected representatives in this House must be able to get the information needed to uncover the truth as we pursue our role in a parliamentary democracy. When an individual does not comply, he or she must be held to account. That is why Mr. Firth must be called to the bar of this House to be admonished by the Speaker, and he must be required to answer the questions that Parliament needs to get the truth behind the ArriveCAN scandal. I urge this House to quickly pass the motion in its original form rather than with the delay tactic that was introduced by the Liberal government. Madam Speaker, I commend these thoughts to the House. Thank you, Madam Speaker.